Hey, welcome to Mineral Talks Live, the weekly live webinar that brings you in-depth and in-person interviews with the mineral people from around the world. Mineral Talks Live is brought to you by a joint effort among the Mineralogical and Geological Museum at Harvard University, the Society of Mineral Museum Professionals, and BlueCap Productions. Tune in every Wednesday and stay connected to your mineral world. Now, broadcasting live from beautiful Honolulu, Hawaii, the land of aloha, ukuleles, and shakas, this is Mineral Talks Live. Hello and welcome back to all of our viewers out there. As you know, we took last week off, but we're glad to be back to our normal schedule now. Today is Wednesday, January 27th, 2021, and we'd like to welcome you to episode 32 of Mineral Talks Live. For those of you tuning in for the first time, Mineral Talks Live is the weekly mineral talk show broadcasting to you live every Wednesday. I'm Brian Swoboda, the president of BlueCap Productions, and together with my partners, Dr. Raquel Alonso Perez from the Mineralogical and Geological Museum at Harvard University, and Dr. Eloise Gaillou from the Society of Mineral Museum Professionals, also known as the SMMP, we'd like to welcome you to our program. Our goal in producing this program has always been to bring together all the different facets of our mineral world, from curators and curatrix to collectors, dealers, miners, researchers, artists, and the media that serves us all. We've all been separated far too long, and this show is one small way to bring us back together. Raquel, Eloise, and I try our best to bring a wide range of guests onto the show, and in doing so, we feel the show reflects the true global nature of our mineral world. Even in the production of the show, this global nature is reflected by the three of us alone spanning 11 time zones, or pretty much half the globe. Now, I share this information with you so that you understand that as an audience, you too are plugged into this global network, and as such, your participation helps to make the show what it is. So we encourage you to participate and be an active part of this show. Now, there are two ways that you can do this. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of buttons. There's one button labeled Chat and another labeled Q&A. The Chat feature allows you to type messages to everyone watching and participating in the show. So when you first sign on, feel free to fire off a chat message to everyone telling us where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, during the interview, our guest and I will be focused on our conversation and not really looking at the chat window. However, both Raquel and Eloise will be very active in those chats, so look for their comments along with everyone else's. At times during the interview, either Raquel or Eloise may interject with questions that you're asking, so you can get an immediate answer from our guests while they're still on the topic. Now, the second way to interact is with the Q&A function. This allows you to submit general questions that we'll try to answer at the end of the interview. Finally, at about 40 minutes into the program, you may see a window pop up on the screen asking a bunch of questions for our weekly poll. These are questions that we carefully curate for each guest. We know that some of you think that this is silly, but hey, we're silly, so go ahead and play along anyway. So with that out of the way, it's time to get on with today's show. Our guest for today is coming to us live all the way from Phoenix, Arizona. You can see him all over the globe at the different major mineral shows, usually with a camera around his neck. His favorite philosophical question is, if you saw a drowning person and you were to choose between saving him or capturing the moment, what aperture would you use? Ladies and gentlemen, straight from this latest gig as lead singer of Jeff and the Emulsion, please welcome Mr. Jeff Scovil. Hey, Jeff, how you doing, buddy?
Oh, just dandy here in Phoenix. We managed to survive our sleet and hailstorm the other day.
Yeah. What's the weather like there right now?
Oh, it's supposed to get up to low 60s maybe, and it's sunny and beautiful. So I'm happy.
Nice, nice. So now, Jeff, as our viewers know, when we have a guest come on, I always like to turn the clock back a little to understand more about the early influences of our guests. You were born in Denver, and your father was a field geologist from Queens who happened to also be a U.S. Army unit photographer in post-World War II Japan. So we got geologist, we've got photographer. Some would say your future career was already written in the stars. And I say this a bit tongue-in-cheek, as your father was also really passionate about astronomy. Tell us briefly about this background.
I'd have to modify that. I say it was written in stone.
But then we'd lose the astronomy link.
Yeah, true. That's true. You got to make choices. Yeah, my father was a geologist. It didn't last long. He was only in the business for 3 years. But ever since he was in high school and before, he was really into astronomy. Building his own telescopes, grinding his own lenses. In those days, you had to grind your own lens to be, an official astronomer or member of the clan. But anyway, I grew up with, I think what intrigued me, well, he created an atmosphere of, let's say, of awareness of science, of, and how the world worked and how, whether it was stars or what was underneath your feet. And he had this funny looking hammer that was really pointy at one end. And that intrigued the heck out of me. And he had one of those goofy little boxes that you see. They still sell them now. Little boxes marked off in little squares. And there's a little piece of rock glued in the middle of each square in the name of what it is. Now, they were just rocks, granite and marble and whatnot. But, somehow that intrigued the hell out of me when I was a kid. Once a nerd, always a nerd. But and he would take me on field collecting trips, road cuts, old abandoned quarries, sit in the car reading an astronomy magazine or book while I was pounding my brains out on a rock somewhere, usually to no avail, but I was having fun. So he was very supportive of my mania. Anyway, he basically did. I blame him for getting us involved in this whole business.
Well, that's great. I mean, it's a very early influence, and in a lot of interviews that I've done, you hear the similar thing, that it's the parents, for the kids lucky enough, who kind of encourage them doing that. Do you remember what mineral was the first one that kind of got you hooked into mineral collecting?
That's hard to say. I do remember a piece of sandstone that I had in my collection that was like brilliant red and kind of zoned to orange. It was like the strangest looking rock I'd ever seen in my life. But I think it probably was a quartz crystal. When you go from just rocks, which are interestingly enough, to actually crystals, it's like this is a light goes off, and suddenly it becomes a lot more interesting. So that was probably the beginning.
So then, where did the whole photography thing come in? I mean, you're a young kid. I think you had told me earlier you were about 8 years old when you first started really getting interested in minerals. Somewhere along the line, photography came in. When was that, and what were the influences? Do you remember?
I'm often asked the chicken or the egg question. Which came first, minerals or photography? Actually, I really had no interest in photography whatsoever, except for taking an occasional snap and borrowing a camera from my dad or something. But during graduation from high school, during the ceremony, my dad gave me an old used Pentax H1A with a Yashica 50 millimeter lens on it. They both had screw mounts at the time and they were interchangeable. And that was my first camera. And, they say timing is everything in comedy or anything else. And suddenly, the timing was right. I was married to that camera. It was an extension of my arm and my eye, and I took it everywhere. When I got to college, I used to terrorize the student union, taking candid shots of people, and people called me the cameraman, because that thing was with me all the time.
So some things haven't changed, is what you're saying.
Yeah, not really. Except a lot of times I don't bring it with me when I'm out in the studio. I've reached the point where I say, I'm not on duty right now. I'm not taking.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you. Yeah. When did it switch from like your kind of candid portrait photography to macro photography?
Well, at the time when I was starting in junior high and all the way through high school and a little bit into college, I worked at a local museum that was set up for kids. At the time it was called the Mid-Fairfield County Youth Museum. I mean, being born in Denver, my father got a job in '59 in Connecticut, so we moved to Connecticut, and there was this museum there, and it fascinated the heck out of me. And they have animals and fossils and minerals and exhibit halls and trails and whatnot. So I became what's called part of the junior staff. And you could go and take care of the animals that they had, cleaning their cages, feeding them, taking care of trails, taking care of collections. And so, of course, I spent most of my time in the dark basement working with the minerals. And now, why was I off on that tangent? Anyway.
We don't know, but the age is not showing, I promise to you.
Not a bit. Not this gray here. Let's see. A little touch right there, Brian. Just a touch. Starting to look distinguished.
Salt and pepper, brother. Salt and pepper. It's totally hip now.
Oh, well, when I worked at the museum, they had the nature trails, and I loved going out on the trails. And for some weird reason, what immediately fascinated me was photographing little things, flowers, insects. And you'd often find me lying on my belly in the mud or in the middle of a field somewhere, photographing some bug or a really pretty flower. And so I was really enjoying that for a good while. And so I don't know why, I just sort of gravitated towards shooting little things. And of course, later on, that led me into photographing minerals. But that was another
into a career. Yeah.
Yeah. That was another step because I started off as a geology major at Southern Connecticut State University and found that the math was killing me. It was one of those typical things. If it was a course I was interested in, I loved it and got straight A's. If I wasn't interested in it, I didn't do a damn thing and got maybe D's if I was lucky. Yeah. But I switched over to another passion I had was archaeology. So I switched over to being an anthro and archaeology major eventually. And asked a professor one day about how do you get on a dig? And he gave me a list of an organization actually that kept lists of everybody pretty much in the world that ran digs, primarily universities and colleges. And so I applied to a number of them and eventually got on a dig in Southwest New Mexico. This actually was a follow-up to the fact that the summer before, which had been summer 71, I went out west with a man who helped out the museum occasionally by giving them fossils. He was a retired field collector for the American Museum of Natural History. And he invited me along, and I spent a summer with him in New Mexico and Wyoming collecting fossils. Loved the area, absolutely loved it. And so when I applied to all these places, I realized that one of them was called Salmon Ruin, and it was right in the same area, northwest New Mexico, near Farmington, that I'd been the summer before. And I just made up my mind that if I got accepted at that one, that's where I was going. And of course, that's what happened. So I spent that summer as a field excavator, getting credit to bring back to my university in Connecticut, and volunteered my services as a photographer to the director of the dig. And she eventually invited me to come back and stuck me in the lab. So I ended up photographing all the things that were dug up, all the way from beads to fairly large pots and whatnot. And so I immersed myself immediately into the field of scientific photography, reading everything I could on how to photograph anywhere from medical specimens to forensics photography to what little there was published on archaeological photography. And after doing that for about 3 years, I decided, let's apply these techniques to minerals. And so in 75, I took my first picture of a mineral. And
do you remember what that mineral was?
No idea.
Okay.
It was pretty sad.
I think we need to edit that part out.
Yeah. No idea. Yeah, they say you remember your first kiss. I don't remember that either. But sorry to whoever.
The answer is Leslie.
It wasn't Leslie. So don't worry about catching hell for that. Yeah.
Well, cool. All right. Let's start talking about your mineral photography. I think it'd be helpful if you describe to the audience kind of your shooting stage before we talk about the specifics of each photograph. And so I have a picture here of your shooting stage, and maybe you can go ahead and share with the audience what we're looking at and some of the tools that you use here.
Okay. Well, generally, about 95% of my shooting is done on this stage, which I designed and built myself. This is actually what I call the Mark III. I'm working on the Mark IV right now. Anyway, it keeps evolving.
Okay, Tony Stark.
Yeah. Based on, sometimes the ideas that I incorporate in a new model are great and some of the other ideas are terrible. So I keep modifying it and refining it. Anyway, basically what it is a sheet of glass that's suspended about 18 inches across above the surface. And I see the glass there, yep, that this Papagoite included quartz crystal from South Africa is resting on. And hanging from it's a non-glare picture framing glass with the non-glare side up. And this means that if I do get shadows, reflections, whatever, they're kind of soft and they're not too sharp and edgy. which isn't such a horrible thing either, but it's just kind of the style that I've worked with mostly. Anyway, hanging from its far edge there, you can see is a piece of black paper. And hanging, if we move up a little bit, you see that hanging from the far side opposite the camera is a piece of tissue paper, basically tissue paper. Actually, it's double matte drafting mylar. It can be other things. It could be cloth, whatever works for you. And on its far side is a light. So it's essentially kind of a rear projection screen. The light hits it. You can see kind of a halo there. And from the angle of the camera, this throws a reflection, a halo around the base of the specimen. It gives me a nice neutral halo. Now, another technique I use, basically the same setup, except there's a colored piece of paper back there instead of the black, and black hanging up above, and there's no backlight on the tissue paper. Tissue paper is replaced by a piece of black, so I don't get reflections off the glass from whatever's on the far side of my table. And then I have a light coming from underneath the glass, basically set up right below the camera, aimed at a colored background, and I can get a colored halo and anywhere I want, any size I want. Anyway, the thing that that I have to emphasize is that crystals, when you're shooting crystals, a crystal is a solid defined by planar or roughly planar surfaces. You have to define the crystal faces. So all of these little cards that you see that have kind of blue edges are actually, the other side of them is faced with the matte side of aluminum foil. And I have other types of reflectors too. You can see along the bottom edge there's a whole line of reflectors all the way from white cards to matte metallic to extremely lustrous reflective metallic. And I choose the card that I want based on the reflectivity of the mineral specimen as well as the effect that I want to achieve. So anyway, I've got little arms and gizmos and clamps and whatnot that hold cards all over the place to get reflections off of off of the crystal faces. A lot of them are just held in place by a blob of putty if they're sitting directly on the glass. Anyway, very, very careful placement of all these reflectors to get reflections off the crystal faces, not just to define the faces, but to show the texture of the faces. Are there striations? Are there growth features? Are there etch pits? Whatever. And being careful not to hide with too many reflections, the transparency, the color of the specimen, phantoms inside of it, inclusions, or what have you. So it takes a lot of very careful work. I always emphasize the fact that you've got to be very, very patient and methodical and a bit or very OCD to do this kind of work. So,
Jeff, what is this thing above the crystal? Is that just a diffuser to diffuse the light coming down, or are you using that as a reflector?
That's a little auxiliary diffuser. One of the termination faces on that quartz is getting a very bright light from my main light source, which is above and diffused in something that's called a light box. And sometimes even if, in spite of its diffusion, sometimes it's a little bright. So I threw in a little piece of that double matte drafting mylar to tone down the reflection on that one termination face.
Okay. And you use flash heads for this, or studio strobes. Do you just use one head, or I can only see one head here. I don't know if you ever use a second or a tertiary head.
Most of the lighting, probably 90% of the lighting, comes from one diffused flash head above, as you see. I've got some black paper hanging from it, as you can see, which helps keep it out of my eyeballs and off of the background.
Okay.
But yeah, flash I use because it's primarily the color balance. The color rendition is more accurate than most any other light source. It's a little more expensive to work with or to buy, but it produces the best results overall. I do have another light, which is probably not being used for this shot. It's off to the right of my camera and out of the field of view to the right. And that usually has either basically it's kind of a confined light source, more like a spot. I use what's called a honeycomb spot grid, generally a 10 degree, or a snoot, which basically is just a tin can on the front of the light, which reduces the angle of coverage. And that comes in from the right and adds a little bit of life and sparkle to the specimen. So that is used on a lot of my photographs, but not all. And then the third light is basically the light that is producing the halo in the background, which in this case, you don't see the light, but you do see it's the hot spot is producing on that diffuser on the far side of the lens.
Okay, I got it. Yeah. So now, for people unfamiliar, this type of flash head, it has a modeling light, and that's what we're seeing being used here. And that's just to help you position the light and see what is being lit. Jeff, how much do you rely on that modeling light to set up the photograph versus actually taking the photograph and seeing where the reflections fall on the crystal?
Yeah, the modeling light is absolutely essential. I always tell people, well, most people are only familiar with flash, like the one that pops up on the top of your camera.
Right.
I recommend that no one ever use that if you're serious. If you just want to take a snap of the piece, fine. But otherwise, you're literally shooting in the dark. You cannot see what the results are going to be. And the basic thing about photographing minerals is that you have to have total, extremely precise control. So every one of those light heads that I use with the flash system, actually there's two lights in it. There's a flash tube, and usually which is a halogen light most of the time. And circling it is usually a semicircular or little horseshoe-shaped flash tube. So essentially, the two lights are especially when they're diffused, are exactly going to produce the exact same results. And so,
Jeff, let me go back and just clarify. The center light is the modeling light, and it's usually a halogen, because you called it a flash tube, and the circular tube that surrounds that is the actual strobe, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So the light, I turn on the modeling lights on most units, if they're any good, can be turned off and on separately from the flash tube. So you have the modeling light on, and you get all your cards to reflect the light primarily from the main diffused light source above onto the specimen. When you take the picture, the flash goes off and gives you the exact same lighting as the modeling light, at least as far as its nature and its origin, the angle, and everything else. But the difference is that halogen lights tend to be very warm. They don't have much blue and green in them. And so even if you color balance for them, which you can do, the results are quite good, but with a flash, it's much better. Anyway, the flash is so much more powerful than the modeling light that you can keep the modeling light on when you take the picture. It will not affect the picture because the flash is so strong and so extremely short in duration that it completely drowns out the modeling light, and the modeling light has no effect on the actual picture. Now, if you
Jeff, I've got two more equipment questions before we start going into some of your photographs. I think the flashes, the strobe system that you use are the heads that are connected by wire to the power pack. There are also what they call monolights, where everything is built into one unit and you don't have an external power pack. Are there any differences between those two, and which would lead to your choosing one or the other?
Well, you're right. When I travel these days, I used to travel with the type that everything was plugged into a power pack. And you certainly have more wires running around. Mm-hmm. I prefer the monolights because they are much more individually controllable. You can completely turn them off. You can turn them on. You can change their power separately. Now, you can do that too with the type that has a power pack, that you have what's called symmetrical and asymmetrical power packs. And an asymmetrical means basically you can control each light. There's a control for each light with a little knob to change its power. Less expensive ones, they all have, which are called symmetrical, have all the exact same power. And so it's much more difficult to control the power of individual heads, because you may decide, well, your background light's too bright or it's too dim and you want to brighten it up. And if they're all the same power, it's a little difficult to change the brightness of that light. You can do it, but it's just a little bit more effort involved. One disadvantage of monolights is that they are, because they contain all the controls instead of a separate power pack, they tend to be a little larger and a little heavier. That's not a big deal. Just got to make sure you got a boom that's well counterbalanced and tightened down well so the whole thing doesn't come crashing down on the specimen and you end up in a lawsuit.
Okay. Final question before we get to the mineral photos, which I think everyone is dying for. It doesn't matter what kind of camera you use.
Not too much. The primary thing is, of course, is the photographer. You can give someone who does not know beans the finest equipment in the world, and they're going to produce crummy photographs. And the opposite is true too. A crummy camera in the hands of a master is going to produce good results. That said, it does help to have a good camera. The most important thing is the glass, your lens. And
Okay.
for the most part, there used to be some cameras way back when digital started getting hot that were, I think it was a Coolpix that had a fixed lens. It was not interchangeable, but it was designed to go to 1-to-1, life size, which was fantastic. A lot of the dealers used to use those cameras for their web sales and photography on the websites. But what I would really recommend is you get what's called a DSLR, which means a digital single lens reflex, as opposed to the old ones, which were just film single lens reflexes. If it's got interchangeable lenses, that means you can choose the lens that you want that suits your needs. And a good quality macro lens is absolutely necessary. Most of my shooting is done with a 50 or 60 millimeter macro, but I also use 105 millimeter. I use Nikon. It's not critical. I use Canon for years. They're excellent quality. Fuji's great. Leica, almost any of the major brands is going to be good if you learn how to use it. So.
Right. And so I'm just going to do a little clarification. You had used the term 1-to-1, and for the people who aren't familiar with that, 1-to-1 is a ratio between the actual size of the object you're shooting and the actual size that shows up on the sensor. So when we say 1-to-1 macro, the image that is on the sensor, or in the old days on the film, is exactly life size. And so when you're looking for macro lenses, you'll always see that kind of ratio in there to tell you the magnification power of the lens itself.
Right. Yeah. If you use you can use a regular lens, but most regular lenses will only focus up to about 18 inches. And the maximum magnification, there is no magnification. It may be only a fourth the size or less than what you really want to moderately fill the sensor or your film.
Okay, fair enough.
And just before we go further, I have two questions that are on purpose right now. Dan is asking, what are the best online sources to learn and share amongst the mineral photography community? Do you have any links that we can share to the people? Maybe we can do that a bit later. But if you have any online information, so that for people who don't know everything right away and understand everything that you say right now, can they look somewhere on the internet to have this information?
Yes, if you are on Facebook, there is a special interest group called not sure exactly what it is, mineral photography or how to take better mineral pictures. There's at least one, maybe two groups that share. They're constantly posting pictures that the members have taken and how they took the images and answering questions from members. That's an excellent one.
Excellent, thanks. And Vera had a question regarding the quartz crystal that you were shooting. Was that a new find or that was an old one from the 90s? Do you know?
Oh, that was an old piece. Yeah, I don't think anything really has come out in quite a few years now.
Thank you.
Doyen.
Made me think of a question, but it's left my mind. Hello, Alzheimer. Hey, let's go to mineral photographs. You ready? You ready, Jeff?
I think we can do that.
Okay. Tell us about this one.
Well, that was first of all, it's just a boggling specimen. It is, it's only 1.5 centimeters high, so that's maybe 5/8 of an inch. But the way the crystals are grown and with that little bridge, it is absolutely awesome. It's a cuprite from the Milpillas mine in Sonora, Mexico, from Valenzuela's Minerals. And they brought that to me, I think during the last Tucson show a year ago. And It's a phenomenal piece. It really didn't require much backlighting for it to glow like that because it's relatively small and pretty gemmy. Something we did not discuss. This photograph was taken with a technique I've been using now maybe 6 years, excuse me, called stacking or focus stacking, which basically means, excuse me, the problem is when you photograph anything very small, you have a very limited depth of field, which means what is in focus from front to back. And so if you took a picture of this with just a single shot, say even if at f22 or f32, which is maximum depth of field, it would still not be all in focus, and it would also not be very sharp. So in photo stacking, focus stacking, what you do is you take multiple photographs at a very shallow depth of field, starting at the front and working to the back. And the software combines the sharpest of those images, so you end up with a shot that is absolutely in focus, front to back, and sharper than a standard picture. So,
hey, Jeff,
anyway.
when you're photo stacking, there are two ways of changing that focal plane. One is by adjusting the lens itself. The other is by moving the camera. Which technique do you use?
Well, there's actually three ways.
Oh, what's the third way?
You can change the focus, focusing a little bit more and more into it, which is how I do it.
Okay.
You can move the camera forward with each one on a special rail, or the specimen can be moved back and forward.
Sure. Okay.
And especially with tiny things, if you're photographing little tiny things and you've got long bellows, heavy lens and all that, it is much easier to move the specimen if it's possible with your setup because it's much smaller and lighter. So
why do you choose to adjust the lens versus moving the camera or moving the specimen?
It's the easiest and cheapest.
All right. And with that...
And another question, are you using a free stacking software or you pay for one, and which one is it that you use?
I'm using one that actually costs, it's not an awful lot. I think it's a little over $100. And there are several that are available. There's one that's called Zreen, and then there's another one called Combine Z. And now I'm going to have a senior moment, and I don't remember what which one I use.
That's fine. Just when you remember, just to let us know. Thanks.
Anyway,
Thanks, Jeff.
You use the one on the computer.
Yeah. No, something that's kind of an interesting thing is you can actually the software that I use, it's basically two parts. One is takes all the images you've taken and combines them. So that's the post-production aspect. The other aspect of it is it actually controls the camera and the focus. And what you do is you start at the closest part and you go to the farthest part you want in focus. And the software recognizes that. And when you hit the button go, it automatically takes a picture, changes the focus, takes the picture, changes the focus until it's gone through the whole sequence. So you do not have to do it manually. It's really a cool thing to do. And it's very consistent. But so far, I've just been doing it manually.
How many stacked photos did you have to take to build this image, and what's your average?
The larger the piece, the fewer the photos you need to take. The biggest one that I've done so far, my biggest stack was 105 individual shots.
Yowza.
This one was probably around 25.
Okay.
And I've done as few as...
That's still quite a lot. It seems like a lot.
Yeah. But again, the smaller the subject, the more images you need.
Right, because the shallower depth of field.
Right.
Hey, I remember my question from earlier. A few years back, you used to run a photo studio in conjunction with Gloria Stabler from Lithography, and I think you were doing it with Michael Bainbridge. Are you still doing those, or do you have plans on doing those at future Tucson shows?
Yeah, we had a 3-day hands-on workshop where everybody got a simplified version of my stand, which they could buy for a nominal fee and take home with them. And we held it for 3 years running, and it was held in part of the restaurant of the Inn Suites, now the Hotel Tucson City Center. Unfortunately, we quit running the the workshop because they turned it into a mineral dealer spot. So we lost our free space. So we have not actually had that workshop now for about 4 years. I would like to do another one. And if anybody is interested in contacting me about doing it when we eventually get around to finding another space, then please contact me and I'll put you on the list and you'll be notified when we do that.
Well, that's exciting with all the new venues popping up, Mineral City and all over Tucson. Who knows? It sounds like there's a good chance that a space could open up again.
Right.
All right, let's go to photo number 2.
Nice little rock. This is a beautiful topaz on smoky quartz from the Shigar Valley in Pakistan, northern Pakistan. And it's now in the Steve Smale collection. It's only 6.6 centimeters high, so that makes it just about 2 5/8, 2 3/4 or so. And I actually originally shot this back in probably 1994 when it belonged to Sandorf Fuss, and on 4x5 transparency film, and it became my second Tucson show poster in 1995. Yeah. Anyway, the nice thing is that sometimes I get to photograph specimens again and again as they go around from one collector to another. And the nice thing about that is I can compete with myself and see if I can do a better job. So this one was done digitally just earlier last spring, when I was up at Steve Smale's place. And the nice thing is I was able to change the background, which I like better. I stacked this photograph so it was all in focus. If you look at the original one, the far edge of the specimen is a little soft. And I was able to refine my lighting and reflections a little bit. So I think it was a big improvement. You can see here the definition of the crystal faces. The striations show up very nicely. You can see the transparency of the topaz crystal, but you can still see all of its crystal faces. So particularly important with the gem crystal is that you'd be able to see the color and the transparency of the piece.
Jeff, one question I have, and I'm trying to figure out a way to put this delicately, but can't figure it out, so I'm going to throw it out there. Megapixels, does size really matter?
I don't think I'm going to really go with that one, but anyway. My wife's not watching, so she can't comment or beat me. Yes, the number of megapixels, which is basically pixel is comparable in digital photography to the old days in film when we talked about grain. And in the old days, there was little tiny specks of silver halide on the film that really, their size, the smaller they were, the higher your resolution, the finer the detail you could attain. The same thing goes with pixels on a digital camera. The more of them there are, the smaller they are, the higher the resolution, which basically means the more you can blow it up without starting to see what we call now. In the old days, they called it grain. Now we call it pixelization. And you've probably all seen pictures that were done very low resolution and they're published, and you can see this funny, weird, grainy micro mosaic pattern on your photograph, which you certainly don't want. So basically it means you can have a sharper picture and you can blow it up much larger without seeing pixelization. So the higher the resolution on the camera, the more megapixels there are, the sharper the image is going to be. But you do reach a point of diminishing returns. If you're never going to be publishing or printing a picture bigger than a particular size, then you don't need super high resolution or megapixel cameras. If you're going to print in a magazine where the picture size is no more than 8.5 by 11 inches, having a 40 megapixel camera is not going to do you any good. If you're going to do billboards, you're going to do posters, yes, go for that megapixel camera. But the other thing that's also been an issue, there's been, among camera manufacturers, there's been a race for more pixels. My first
yeah.
camera was 6 megapixels. My second,
just yesterday, I think Sony announced their new A1 camera. That's a 50 megapixel camera. What are they? It's not a DSLR, but what's the new kind of cameras that are out there?
the mirrorless ones.
Yeah, the mirrorless camera. That's it. So they just announced their new 50 megapixel mirrorless camera that shoots 8K video and 4K video at 120 frames per second. And so what you're saying is you don't need it for the kind of work that you do. What megapixel is your camera?
Well, I went from a 6 megapixel D70, Nikon D70. There's something to learn on, without spending a hell of a lot of money. And then I went to their pro model. At the time was the D2XS, and that was a 12.1 megapixel. Woo, doubled. The camera I'm using right now is a 21 megapixel. And but I've also got a D800, a D810, which is 36 megapixels, 35, 36. And again, it's a little bit overboard. If you're not planning on doing billboards, do you really need that? It's like people, audiophiles who are nuts about having the highest possible, the lowest, noise. I don't even know the terminology, but there's a certain point where your ear is not good enough to really hear the difference. And your eyes are not good enough, unless you're blowing it up really big, to know the difference between a 12 and a 50 megapixel camera.
Yeah. So again, it's not a challenge of buying the best equipment. It is a challenge of taking your skills to the furthest level that you possibly can. And so skills trump technology.
Right.
Hey, let's go to another photograph here, Jeff. Tell us what we're looking at here and what you had to do to capture this beautiful image.
Okay. This is a lidocodite tourmaline from Anjanabonoina, Madagascar. And this is also in the Steve Smale collection. And the thing we needed to do here was to do some backlighting on it and to bring out the color and that beautiful transparency. If you'll notice, I have got reflections off of the termination faces, just the narrow ones, so it doesn't obscure the color. And tourmaline, as we all know, most tourmalines have got striations running the length of the crystal. That's a defining characteristic. So I've got reflecting cards, probably some of the matte metallic ones, to the right and the left of the specimen and probably a little bit below the glass. There's one of the advantages of shooting on glass is that you can get lights and reflectors coming up through the glass from below. If you sit a subject directly on an opaque background like plexiglass or paper or whatever, you're limited in your lighting. Anyway, so I got definition of the striations, of the termination here, all the face, whatever faces there are, and the backlighting. Now, in this case here, I used a fiber optic light because it had the focus and the power to be able to nuke it. The light is coming from the right rear. And because it's halogen, I had to change my white balance of the camera to match the white balance, the color temperature of the light source, and worked out quite well. And anyway, what can I say? This shows beautifully, as is the previous shot, how that halo produced by backlighting the piece of tissue on the far side produces a very nice neutral halo. And one of the characteristics of it is you see a dark shadow reflection in front of the specimen, which some people love, some people hate.
Yeah.
And I'm
Jeff,
just going to interrupt once again to ask how big is this tourmaline? And at the same time, I'm going to launch the poll, okay?
Désolé, madame. The specimen is 10.3 centimeters high, so that's just a hair over 4 inches.
Merci, monsieur.
Oh, yeah, madame.
All right, let's go to the next one. Ooh, the Lagrandite. Love this.
So, I just happened to choose for this presentation some killer stuff because Steve Smale has a superb collection of just amazing specimens. So this is another Steve Smale piece. It's a Lagrandite.
Are these photos we're going to see in the new book?
I bet this will be in the new book, definitely.
Okay. All right.
And Not to get off on a tangent, but Steve Smale is putting out a new book, which actually should be out any moment. Anyway, featuring photos exclusively from yours truly. Anyway, there's a beautiful Lagrandite from the Ojuela mine in Mapimi, Durango, Mexico, and it's 8.8 centimeters high. So that's about 3.5 inches. Same basic setup with the neutral halo from behind. One thing that we didn't discuss was, of course, is how do you get the specimens to stand the way they do? Most of the time, I can just use a piece of putty, not clay, not modeling clay, nothing that leaves an oily, icky mess and it's hard to get off. But there's a number of putties out there, usually used for tacking up notices on an office wall or something that you can get from office supply places or art supply stores. Anyway, piece of putty to hold it up. Sometimes I have a little block of wood to give it a little more stability. Sometimes, if the specimen is solid, not heat sensitive, I will use a hot glue gun. So this might have been a hot glue gun to hold this up, as the matrix was fairly hard and not going to be damaged by the heat or its removal of the hot glue.
Did you say what the size is on this?
Yeah, it's about 3.5 inches.
Okay,
in height.
all right.
Or for those with more sophisticated tastes, 8.8 centimeters.
Thank you.
I love how Eloise was the first to respond to that.
Of course, the Europeans know what they're doing. They're using metric, not this stupid imperial system.
Come on, back to mineral photography.
No political commentary. That's marginally political. Anyway, another piece from Steve Smale. I keep having this pole pop up in front of my face here. Anyway, a gorgeous Aquamarine variety of beryl on microcline with albite feldspar. That is also from the Shigar Valley in Pakistan. And it is, I got to get the size here. I do have, it's 9.5 centimeters high, so a little shy of 4 inches. And what can I say here? Sometimes it's difficult photographing a white subject, especially we got white on white here. So that light coming in from the right that I mentioned that is not diffused is from the hard right, kind of a skimming angle, which creates shadows, which helps define the crystals better, particularly on the albite. There's a little bit of fill-in light from the left from one of my cards so that left side of the microcline, the big blocky crystal, is not totally going dark. And obviously a reflector to the right and a little bit behind to catch the right edge of that aquamarine crystal. We can still see the transparency of the crystal by not having too many reflections on it.
Terrific.
That's truly beautiful. And I have so many questions. It's hard to choose right now, but I have one that keeps on coming. So how do you do the color rendition? Do you do a lot of post-production, or do you just shoot it and it has to be the right color right away? How do you deal with color?
Preferably, most colors reproduce pretty well in the camera. But very good question, because there's two serious factors here that you must be aware of. One, most people do not calibrate their monitors. There are ways of calibrating your monitor so that it's correct. The colors on it are correct. You can do all the best photography in the world, but if your monitor is not calibrated for contrast, for color, for brightness, you're gonna be misled and think you're taking crummy pictures. So calibrate your monitor, number one.
So what do you use? Do you use a spider, or I don't know? I'm not like.
Yes, actually, there are several companies that produce calibration devices. They're not too expensive, maybe from $100 to $200. And you download some software into your computer, and it produces a little test pattern. You put the sensor over it, and then hit the button, and it runs through all the different colors so that it can get everything precise. I use a spider. I'm trying to remember the name of the thing, but spider, I think it's spelled with a S-P-Y-D-E-R.
S-P-Y, that's right. Yeah.
Anyway, these things are available at a decent camera store. You can buy them from B&H Photo in New York or whatever. So very critical to do this. The other calibration, which is important, is your camera. The camera, you can't actually calibrate the camera, but again, what you do is you use your camera and you take a picture of a color chart. And there are commercially available small color charts, and you take a photograph with it, and then you can, essentially what you do is you take that picture, put it in your computer, and you create a profile within your computer, within I use Photoshop. You don't have to use Photoshop, but it creates a profile. So whenever I take a picture using that particular camera that I got the profile from, it runs it through the profile and realizes that it has to make minor adjustments to get the camera, the colors exact or as close as possible to correct from that particular camera while you're processing with it. Now, if you use more than one camera, you should use a profile, make a profile for each of the cameras. And if you really want to get fussy, you should have a profile for each of your different lenses. I haven't gotten that fussy. I just have profiles for the camera. So this way,
and this is like a whole science here. And Jeff, you can go on for hours just talking about this, I'm sure. Let's get to a couple more photos before we run out of time. I love this. I mean, I commented the other day, I think, on the AMC group about this. But please tell us about this. Fabulous,
gorgeous thing. This is a fluorite, and this is from the Glacier Argentier, which means the Argentier glacier in the Mont Blanc mountain region near Chamonix, France. And the location is famous for its incredible pink to red fluorite crystals. And this one is in the collection of Barry Kitt. And Barry is a collector, has this in his collection up in Tahoe. And the piece is, let me get find out where I got it here. It's 10.3 centimeters wide, so it's just a hair over 4 inches in width. Now, this is one here. Again, it's on the glass with the reflection, the neutral reflection around it. I do like that neutral reflection because if you have a colorful specimen, choosing a colored background for it can get really tricky, and you can have, it can look kind of garish and be a problem. So I like this neutral background for colored specimens. Anyway, I've got, obviously the crystal faces are a little on the rough side, so I was probably using a very reflective metallic reflector on it and carefully placed to show the crystal faces. Now, obviously, you don't have to have a reflection on every crystal face, because if you did, you'd be obscuring the interior color. Anyway, there's a little bit of backlighting. I did not really try to do backlighting. It's just coming from the main light. I got no fiber optics on or anything. This is just using the flash. Not much else I can say about this piece except that it's gorgeous.
Completely concur with you there. All right, let's talk about gemstones.
Okay, gemstones are not easy to photograph. They can be as tough or more difficult to photograph than minerals. They are sitting the way they naturally sit. I might have used a little bit of hard wax to get the oval in the background to stand up. It's dangerous doing that because sometimes you see right through the stone and you see the wax and it looks like a big blob of who knows what stuck in the back of the stone. So it's a dangerous thing to do, but sometimes you can do it. Anyway, same basic lighting setup. The most important thing you have to remember about photographing a cut stone is the way they're designed to have the light come in through the top, bounce around the back of the stone, and come back out through the top. So lighting has to be essentially coming from the front. No backlighting, no side lighting, from the front. So I have numerous reflectors all around the lens to get light into the stones. And but then the big challenge is the crown facets, which run around the top of the stone. The biggest facet on the top is called the table. Around it are the crown facets, and then the back of the stone are what are known as the pavilion facets. Anyway, you have to be careful not to get reflections off of the crown facets around the top there, so they create horrible reflections and block out the interior of the stone. If you look at that tourmaline on the left, which is the blue-green one, you see one crown facet up near the top that's got a little light, acceptable, not bad reflection off of it. Anyway, so it's can be very difficult to get to avoid getting excessive reflections off of the crown facets when you're shooting, especially the darker the stone gets. Anyway, this was shot at the Tucson show last year. And from left to right, we have a tourmaline, a chrysoberyl, and a rhodolite garnet. And this is from a company called Tavernier. And let me see if I find my notes on this. The largest of the stones is 24.37 carats. Takes a lot of work to take a shot of a gemstone.
Absolutely.
You know, with gem people, color is paramount.
Everything. All right, let's talk about jewelry.
Okay. I do a fair amount of jewelry photography too. And this one was taken for Adam Neely Fine Jewelry. They have stores in both Laguna Beach and in San Francisco. Anyway, this is aquamarine set with gold and diamonds. And I have a little rod that you don't see now, which hangs above my glass that I can hang necklaces from. So they're just touching the glass. And there's a reason for this. Sometimes, as you can see, you get that little reflection at the bottom, a little shadow. The shadow, I think, is really important. It creates some context, a place, you know, you have a feeling that it's not just hanging in space. But also it's important because sometimes these things do not hang the way I want them to. So I actually have them touch a little bit so I can get them to lean back just a little bit at the angle I want. And also so they don't sit there wiggling like a, you know, like a pendulum on a clock and I'm trying to catch it at the right swing. Jewelry is a tough one because you often have a combination of cut stones and very polished metal. Luckily, the metal on this was more of a matte finish. So it takes a lot of work with your reflectors to get the metal to look good and not get too many reflections on the stones and to get them to sparkle. In this case, there's not a lot of sparkle in the aquamarine, but the diamonds certainly sparkle.
Right on. Now, you also do photography of Cameo, other pieces of art that we'll see in a moment after this. Tell us about this one.
Yeah, this is a fairly easy piece to light. It's set up just the way all the minerals have been shot that you've seen so far. It's fairly flat, probably not even, not much more than 1/8 of an inch in thickness. And let me find my notes on this baby. It's 46 millimeters in diameter, so that's a little less than 2 inches. It's in the collection now of Gloria Stabler. It was cut by Idar Oberstein, Germany, carver by the name of Erwin Pauli, or Erwin if you want to anglicize it. And one thing I immediately think about, well, two things. That light that I was mentioning before that's off to the right, that is not diffuse. That is off to the right at a low angle, a grazing angle, which throws shadows and really brings out the detail on this piece. If I just use very flat lighting, you would lose a lot of feeling of the dimensionality of the carving. So a low angle, undiffused light that's not too strong brings out detail. The other thing is, remember I mentioned propping before. Now, in this case here, if I could use a blob of putty or a block of wood to hold it up, but then the problem is because of that halo, that's the light coming from behind that's creating the halo, the background gradation, you would not see the prop, but you would see its shadow around the base of the piece. So a lot of times when I'm shooting things like cameos, cabochons and whatnot, I actually take things like bent paper clips or wires of various sorts, which are puttied or hot glued to the glass, and then they come up and are attached to the back of the piece. And if you look very closely at the bottom of the cameo where it touches the glass, you'll see a tiny little bit of a halo, of a little tiny shadow, which is actually the shadow of the wire being thrown on the glass from the backlighting. So pretty subtle. And if I wanted to with Photoshop, I could take that out completely. You wouldn't see it at all. So propping of a specimen or the subject is an art in itself.
And Erwin Pauli is one of the great masters of Idar Oberstein. He is famous for his cameo carvings. Just wonderful, wonderful work. Speaking of Idar Oberstein, let's talk about this one.
And sorry, while you were showing this beautiful little cutie here. Someone is asking if you always put your signature on the photos, or is just that for tonight's show that you put your signature on the photo?
I only do that when I'm putting it on the internet, so that people who snitch it and do not give credit cannot get away without giving credit.
Perfect. Thank you.
But a client who gets photographs taken for them will not have that on their photograph.
Thanks, Jeff.
But I've got to cover my rear end here, because there are lots of thieves out there on the internet.
Yeah.
As we know. Anyway, yes, I do a lot of photography of other things besides minerals and jewelry and gemstones. Recently, I completed a project photographing a lot of work by the famous carver Gert Dreyer, also of Ida Oberstein. Actually lives outside of Ida Oberstein in Kirchweiler, but close enough. Anyway, a book is going to be published on their work, and of both the senior Gert Dreyer, who died about 2 years ago, and his son Patrick Dreyer, who's carrying on his work and is a superb carver himself. This is not a Dreyer carving, though. This is done by a guy named Alfred Zimmerman, who studied under Gert Dreyer.
And he was also Patrick's teacher for a while.
Yeah, he's a very, very fine carver. This is the first piece I've ever shot of Alfred's work. And this little mouse is carved out of agate. He has sapphire eyes and gold whiskers. And he stands 5.4 centimeters high, so it's just a touch over 2 inches. And this is another one where I photographed it using stacking, because I wanted it to be really sharp as a tack and all in focus. Anyway, the thing with carving such as this is bringing out obviously the texture of the fur, and hopefully a little color of the eye there, showing the fact that it's a sapphire. It's a lot of work to get a piece like this shot, but I absolutely love photographing fine carvings such as this. This will probably
if I'm not mistaken, this is in the collection of Anne Fraser, who I believe is online with us right now, too.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Hopefully I would have remembered to say that shortly. And
I'm sure you would have. You've had a few senior moments in this episode.
It's always wonderful photographing pieces. I shot this for Anne when I was up in Berkeley just a few months ago, I think back in October.
And we are an hour and 5 minutes in the show.
Okay, so that's my not so subtle hint that we need to move to the 5 questions and the Q&A section of our show here, Jeff. So you understand how this goes, right? I'm going to ask you 5 quick-fire questions. You're supposed to respond just from the gut. We're going to see how the audience responded and whether their response matches yours. Are you ready, Mr. Scovil?
I'm braced.
Okay. Question number 1, emulsion or sensor?
Sensor.
Sensor. Question number 2, Canon or Nikon?
Well, I shoot Nikon, so I'll have to go with Nikon.
Of course you do.
It doesn't matter, really. That's what I've got.
No, it doesn't. I mean, you're the only one with the right answer. Everyone else is either right or wrong. It doesn't matter. Mexican food or Thai food is question number 3.
Ooh, comida mexicana. Mexican.
Mexicano, okay. Beer or margarita is question number 4.
Oh, margarita.
Margarita. And final question, is it called a stick shift or is it called a manual?
I usually call it a stick.
A stick shift. Okay, great. Let's go to the poll and see what our viewers saw or how they answered. Eloise, are you ready for our answers here?
That Raquel has been too quiet.
Raquel, you're in the spotlight now, darling.
I knew she would do that today. I don't know why. So
I didn't understand a word you just said, but okay. All right, question number 1. Emulsion or sensor? Jeff chose sensor. What did the viewers say?
Sensor.
Sensor. Bing, 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 bing. Question number 2. Canon or Nikon? Jeff chose Nikon.
Nikon.
Nikon. Okay, it's 2 for 2. Question number 3. Mexican or Thai food?
Of course, Mexican.
Jeff chose Mexican. Everyone went for Mexican. Jeff, everyone knows you. Question number 4. Beer or margarita? Jeff chose margarita with the accent. What did our viewers say?
Cerveza.
Cerveza.
Hey, lástima.
And the final question, stick shift or manual? Jeff said stick shift.
Stick shift.
Stick shift. Okay, we got 4 out of 5. Congratulations. Had we gotten 5 out of 5, all of you would have gotten a free photo shoot from Jeff Scovil. So, sorry, next time.
I knew about that.
Oh, I didn't tell you about that, Jeff. Sorry. Hey, let's go to the Q&A section and see if our viewers have any questions that they've sent to Jeff that he can answer right now.
So Eloise has been asking a lot, and I think we are going to ask you some, Jeff, but if we don't get time, maybe we send you by email if you don't mind, and then get back to those. So let's see how it goes.
No problem.
Sounds good. So what lighting do you use when using a stacking? Do you still use the strobe?
Yeah, strobe. You can do it with continuous lighting, whether it's LED or halogen or what have you. But strobe is a little easier. There's much less trouble with vibration.
How do you deal with dust?
Viciously. Yeah, it's my nemesis. Before every single shot, after every single shot, I carefully clean the glass with, a glass cleaner, Windex or what have you, and to get rid of dust and putty smudges and fingerprints. And then during the time it takes you to set up the shot and get all your lighting just right, it's been snowing the whole time. And so just before I take the shot, I carefully brush around the subject with some very soft brushes to get rid of the dust. So, and you always, no matter how careful you are, you're going to get a little bit of dust. And of course, that's what Photoshop's for. Very quick and easy to get rid of any dust.
Very good. How does one learn how to do photo stacking?
Well, it's actually not very difficult. But to answer the question directly, again, maybe checking out the photo group on Facebook. Somebody there's got some ideas. If you just Google it, I'm sure there's all sorts of tutorials. And I would imagine there's tutorials associated with the companies that make the stacking software.
Have you ever considered delving into the world of micromineral photography?
Yes, it means investing in some lenses that are better suited to that. And there are, going back to the questions that Brian brought up about the different ways of doing stacking, if you're going to be moving the camera, there actually are some motorized, synchronized, geared rails that you can mount your camera on that move it in incredibly fine increments, and they're all synchronized with your computer. One of them, the best known, is one called a stack shot, but there are others available too. But anyway, in answering the question, it would mean an investment in a couple of other things. And the thing is that as much as I love photography, I do this for a living, and most micro miners take their own micro mount shots, and most of them are too tight to pay somebody to take pictures for them. So I don't do micro mount shots.
What is your most widely published image?
Oh, God. That's
Mineral image, not like image of you, just to clarify.
Nobody wants those pictures. I'd have to say years ago, I shot a gorgeous aquamarine with a shoral on it. That was the cover of the Mineralogical record.
You used that for your own kind of logo for a while, didn't you?
I think I had it on my business card for a while.
Yeah.
It was a poster for the St. Maurice show. It was a cover of the magazine. It ended up being used in full-page ads. It was stolen by an Afghan dealer for his logo to put on, on all his advertising. It's been published, I don't know how many times, how many places. And that's got to be probably the one.
Very good. What is the hardest color to photograph? Is it shiny black?
No, actually, that's not that difficult. Which gets me back, as we were talking about lighting, is that there are certain colors that are extremely difficult to light. For instance, the green of emeralds and the green of dioptase are miserable. It's very hard. Digital hates those colors, whereas film was actually pretty good with it. Obviously, all the calibration and profiles you do is going to help, but then that's where Photoshop comes in handy. Afterwards, you can play with it to get it even closer to the correct color. But they're miserable.
Processing software that you use.
Well, I use Photoshop, and I chose Photoshop because it's pretty much the best known, it's the widest used, it's the standard, really. Nikon makes the software for processing. There's a number of things. And I actually do use Photoshop. I don't use Lightroom or, to remember the name of the other one, made also by Photoshop. Photoshop I use because it's also, it can do the most things. In Lightroom, you don't have quite the options for processing, like changing backgrounds, doing stacking, compositing pictures and all that. It's not nearly as proficient in doing those things. So Photoshop has got all the options, no limitations.
And the nice thing about Photoshop now is Adobe has a subscription service. So in the past, you'd have to shell out multiple hundreds of dollars for your copy of Photoshop. Now they have all different levels of subscription depending on what Adobe software you want. So you can find whatever package meets your budget, and then you just have a monthly charge, and you use that as long as you keep subscribing.
Yeah, that was when I first got Photoshop 11 years ago, it cost me $750, just boing.
Yeah, I was going to say it was like an $800 package.
Yeah. And now it's like, I can't remember what it is now, $19 a month or something?
Yeah, so I think it goes as low as that. I've got a bigger package that has all the video editing stuff for the stuff that I do. But you can basically custom design your package.
Yeah, I love the fact that it's subscription only, because then it doesn't cost me a hell of a lot of money right up front. And the advantage too is when you subscribe like that, especially now with the internet, you get automatic updates. You don't have to buy
in the old days, you'd pay $800 for the software, and then you'd have to pay another $350 for the updates.
Every time you update it, which would be once a year.
Yep.
Next question.
Oh, sorry,
how much can you do post-production on color versus having to change the warmth of your actual lighting to compensate for the halogen lighting?
Well, I suppose it depends on how far off the color is. I'm not a great master at working with color at this point on Photoshop. I have a lot to learn there, but it can drive you crazy and be very, very difficult to do. But if it's not a real tough one, it's a fairly simple thing to do in many cases. So what was the beginning of that question? We were comparing with what?
When it's comparing the post-production of color versus kind of tweaking the warmth of the light.
Oh,
I think there are a couple. There are a couple
it's more
issues
what you
there.
do, I guess. If you work with the light, or you prefer to do post-production, or you try. I think from your perspective, it seems like you really work with the lighting.
Yeah.
And then you don't do much post-production in terms of color, right?
I think the basic philosophy that I have is do it as correctly as possible in camera to save yourself a lot of time later, because what might take you an extra 5 minutes to do by playing with your lights or whatever you're doing while actually shooting, it could take you a hell of a lot longer if you say, oh, I can fix it in Photoshop. And because you might spend half an hour doing something in Photoshop afterwards. Now, if you If you live alone, you don't have a family, don't have a wife or a husband, demanding dogs or cats, that's fine. You can spend all the time you want playing with Photoshop. It's fun to play with. But if you actually have a business and you're trying to make a buck, the more time you spend on Photoshop, the lower your profit margin is, and the less time you have to finish the rest of your work and get your honeydews done around the house. So get it right in camera. And I think the other problem is that too many people now work with Photoshop and know that it can do all kinds of cool things. But I think the more you do with Photoshop and put it off later for Photoshop, I think it makes you a sloppier photographer in the first place. You know, learn to do it right in camera and do as little Photoshopping as possible. And I love Photoshop.
I'm going to interrupt because I put a question aside that a few people were asking. With the lockdown, are you planning on doing any online workshop? Sorry, Raquel, about that.
The subject
would be nice. That would be really nice.
Yeah, the subject
online
has
workshop.
come up. I think that's a very good idea.
Eloise and I can help you.
Yeah.
We have become very good. Exactly. We can be your background helpers. We are good at it now.
It's a great idea.
Okay,
but,
so Jeff Scovil's online Zoom photo class will be here at Mineral Talks Live. Send your PayPal information.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. The only issue with that is, of course, is that you do need to have actually some pretty decent camera work and cameraman showing what it is that I'm doing. Can't just do it pretty much sitting here like this. Now, I've done a number of PowerPoint presentations, where I show the setups and what you can do with the lighting and whatnot. It's not the same, obviously, as a hands-on like I've done in the past, but it's a lot better than nothing. So yes, I have to give some thought to that about how to put something like that together and do a Zoom. That would be a great idea.
That would be great.
We even do a few days, so people get time and then they take pictures and the next day they show to you. So I think that would be very beneficial for people really trying to learn. Yeah, for their own, not even coming to your standard, but more for their own. Yeah.
Well, here's an interesting thought for anyone who's thinking about something like that. What would that be worth to you? What would you be willing to pay? Because, all of it costs money to put together, and it would probably help Jeff figure out the profitability of moving forward on a project like that.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great idea, especially in time of COVID and lack of a place to put together such a workshop. It could be live from Jeff's studio in Phoenix, Arizona.
I know. Okay, maybe a few more questions, but that was an important one. So from Bruce Kelly, when stacking, he finds that the software has difficult time representing the transparency of the gemmy crystals. Now, your mate Topaz demonstrate that you have solved that. How?
I haven't really had any trouble with that. I must say that for the first 4 years I was doing stacking, I was using it. Stacking is actually built into Photoshop. Now, they may have improved it, but when I was doing stacking with Photoshop a number of years ago, I found it was absolutely disgusting, detestable, horrible. I would not recommend anybody do stacking with Photoshop. It was complicated, very involved, and the results were poor. And I did run into a lot of problems with it. It wasn't with transparency, but a lot of what they call artifacts because of the process. You get weird like halos around things. If two crystals were slightly different levels, the lower crystal would have a weird halo on across it from the upper crystal. It was just miserable. So there, Photoshop. But anyway, I've really had no trouble with transparency with doing with stacking, not at all.
Okay.
So I don't know what the issue could be or what would to solve it. So can't really help an awful lot on that.
Yeah. From Mike Sweeney. Do you have any plans to update your photography, minerals, and fossils book for a digital and new equipment available since it was published?
Yes, only 25 years ago. Hard to believe. Yes, actually, I have started revising it. And with COVID, I actually got some time to sit and really work on it seriously. But since I've gotten some pretty good jobs recently, it's kind of been put back on the back burner. But I would like to get it. I would say I'd like to get it revised and published again within about 2 years. And it's being done completely in the context of digital photography.
Beautiful.
And I'm sure no one's going to cry about it, but I've decided to drop the chapter on fossil photography.
What? How dare you?
I'm expanding gem and jewelry photography. Anyway, yeah, it's in the works.
I think some of us might like that more than fossils too. So
Once again,
Behave, Raquel.
I photograph very few fossils, and most fossils are not that difficult to photograph, and most fossil collectors photograph them themselves. So to heck with it.
All right, I'm gonna flash this real quick and tease everybody. That is a fossil photograph that Jeff Scovil did that we didn't have time to get to, but apparently we did.
There you go.
Okay, my last question, I promise, Eloise. Richard Schwab, he is a chemical mineralogist and paleontologist, and he's thinking about buying a stereoscope to take photos of microfossils. What is the best camera or setup to accomplish this?
Well, again, it's the camera is not so critical. In this case here, it's the microscope. A normal stereoscopic microscope is not good for taking photographs of minerals or much anything else. If you can buy a trinocular scope, that is, it has the two tubes that you look through with the two oculars. There's a third tube that you mount the camera on. It's designed for photography. And there's a number of reasons why such a microscope is better for that use. So first of all, get a good trinocular microscope, and you have to get a good DSLR that has interchangeable lenses. Otherwise, it gets very difficult to actually mount it on the microscope. One thing to keep in mind is a lot of microscopes are set up so that you can mount a camera on it, but it's minus the ocular, minus the eyepiece. So you're only getting the magnification of the primary objective, which may only be 10 or 15x. So you're not getting an awful lot of magnification. So if you can get one that you can mount it with an ocular on it, then you get the two put together, the two lenses put together, and you get much higher magnification. So, and you must keep in mind that a lot of microscopes are designed. They're for visual, for looking at with your eyeballs, and they're not designed for the high resolution you need for photo microscopy. So anybody who's going to buy a trinocular microscope, also make sure that your primary objective or lens is designed for photography. But the camera you use on it, whatever turns you on, whatever you've got.
Thank you so much.
One last quick question. Where do you get your little gooseneck clips? The things that, you clip and then you hang your
Japan.
Black little clips.
Those little, what I call bead arms or whatever.
Yes.
Nobody sells them in the US. I discovered them in a camera store in Osaka, Japan, years ago, like 15 years ago. And I have a friend in Japan who is a collector, dealer, and photographer. And whenever I need more, I email him and he sends them to me. But nobody sells them here in the US.
Okay, so that's not going to solve our problem. Okay, well, thanks.
I could, I don't know if my friend in Japan wants to become a middleman in selling these things. I thought about importing them, but I don't know if I want to get into importing licenses and all that, and small profit margins and all that stuff. So it's just tough to say.
I feel it's something that you can buy on the Sky Mall on something like that,
Well, an alternative. Here's an alternative. Get yourself a wire that's used for wiring your electricity in your house. but not quite as heavy duty. The stuff that normally we use in the US is called 12 gauge. It's too stiff. Maybe a 14 gauge or a 16 gauge. And you get little alligator clips from an electronic supply place, and you squeeze them or solder them onto the ends. And then they can clip onto the edge of the glass, the edge of your stand. If you have an alligator clip on just one end, you can drill a hole in something heavy and jam it in there so that it stands. And that would work just as well.
Yep. Great. Thank you. Okay, we're an hour and a half in, guys.
All right. So are we done with the questions for Jeff?
So many. They keep on coming, so we have to
Okay. At some point, we
Thank
gotta
you so
end,
much, Jeff, for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
We're going to end it here. If you haven't gotten enough of Jeff, and by God, why would you have? Tune in again to What's Hot in Tucson, a live broadcast tomorrow. Jeff's going to be on our show tomorrow, and he's going to be talking about his top 10 Tucson photos from the 2020 year, which was last year. So that's going to be tomorrow between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. Tucson time. You can see that BlueCap Productions Facebook page or BlueCap Productions YouTube channel. Also tomorrow, towards the end of the day, we're going to release this interview with this dashing-looking young man that was originally aired back in January 6th. And so this was the Mineral Talks Live interview with yours truly from BlueCap Productions. That will go live tomorrow. And again, tune in next week. We're going to have another great interview. We're going to have Dr. Federico Pizzotta, the curator from the National History Museum of Milano, with us next week. And we're going to get a peek into the museum, the redesigned museum. And we're looking forward to that. Same bat time, same bat channel. So thank you, Jeff, for joining us. Thank all of our guests for being with us today. Stay safe. Take care. Aloha.